Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Radio Sophia. The last 1.5 years have been a constant effort for thriving and survival, even when the most notorious waves have hit the shore and many more are waiting in the wings. For the audience, which is largely from the academia, these moments of frustration are not new and very much coexistent with the long years we spend as the teacher, as the researcher, and as a student. We've heard our frustration being muttered, sometimes being stuttered, but rarely being uttered. And we are privileged to have with us on Radio Sophia, Professor Devoshmita Chakraborty, to actually give a sense of how one manages to thrive in the face of rejections, failures, and the imposter syndrome in academia. Professor Devoshmita is currently a faculty at the Ravi J. Mathai Center for Educational Innovation at the IIM Ahmedabad. She has earlier taught at the Washington State University after having done her PhD in science education at the University of Virginia and serving as a postdoctoral researcher in Leibniz Institute for Science and Mathematics Education and the University of Nebraska. Her research interests revolve around science education, higher education, STEM education, medical education, imposter phenomenon, gender, and underrepresented minorities. Thank you for accepting the invite, Professor Devoshmita, and we look forward eagerly to today's session. Over to you, ma'am. Also, for the benefit of the audience, you can actually type in your questions on the chat box. Also, it would be good if you kind of give your introduction, as ma'am has suggested, and I mean, this will be as interactive as much as possible. Thank you, and over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Himadri, for inviting me. Thank you for a very warm welcome. It's an honor to be here, to be meeting all of you. Like Himadri said, feel free to introduce yourself, at least what program you are in, what department you are in, and also feel free to ask your questions. Be as specific as possible. Something I might not know the answer to all questions, but I can certainly direct you to some possible ways in which we can think about those questions. So unlike many other talks, I do not have a PowerPoint with me because beyond a point, it just gets a little, you know, whether you are supposed to read the slides or what, whether you are supposed to listen to me. I want it to be a very informal conversation. In addition to what Himadri said, I focused the last 4 years of my career trying to understand what we know as the imposter syndrome. Now, what attracted me to studying the imposter syndrome? This is not something that my PhD advisor did. When I was doing my PhD and I finished back in 2013, one thing that he said is eventually when you graduate, you should have your own research. People should not know you as Robert. His name is Robert, so Robert's student. You should have your own, you should move a little bit far from what you're doing with me, and you should establish something that you've done on your, that you do on your own, because the ultimate aim is to show that you can do independent research. That's the point. You do a PhD, you learn certain things, you have a very close working relationship with your advisor, but then you move away from what you did. So it was good to know that early on. I was working on a project where I was interviewing a lot of physicians and PhDs in biomedical sciences for my PhD. For a project that was very different. It was something related to medical education. But during those interviews, what I found was a lot of people talked about being very successful and yet feeling like an imposter. Now, back in the days, I did not know what imposter syndrome is, so I looked it up. And what fascinated me was the irony of the situation where there is so much of effort to recruit people into science fields, into STEM fields, or in any field for that matter. And here are people who are already good, they're talented, they're successful, they're already in the field. And for some reason, not quite clear, they don't believe in their ability. So that was the message I latched onto. And from there, my advisor and I, we parted ways in terms of research topics, and I pursued my own line of research. Now, it's not been a linear process because when I started doing research on the imposter syndrome, I had a certain idea about what are the gaps in the literature and what are the things that I'm supposed to do. But over the 4 years, as I have read more and I have published more and I have talked to more people, I've met people at conferences, I've had certain new ideas that could be an offshoot of the imposter syndrome research. The message, the takeaway message is that you never know what you get into. Like, I know there's a lot of literature now on the imposter syndrome. It's become a fairly popular topic in the last few years. There's also a lot of literature on workplace violence, harassment, sexual, non-sexual, any kind of workplace harassment. But what I found recently is there's very little research that connects the two. That connection is not there. So now that has become my new fascination for the last few months, where I'm looking at what may be the connections between people who experience workplace violence, and as a result, they may feel like an imposter. So those are the things that I've been doing. The other thing that has really fascinated me since I moved to IIM Ahmedabad, and this was sometime in 2018, is to have more conversations about failures and rejections and how do people make meaning of those things. Because once again, you know, the way we frame failures and successes has a certain context behind it. And people talk about success all the time. All you have to do is go to LinkedIn, and there's this unending stream of people having achieved something, having got a degree, having got a certificate, having got whatever, good for them. What I find is a strange imbalance. I feel that the entire story is not out there for me to understand. Yeah, I mean, it's sure, I mean, you go and read about someone getting something, but what happened? How did they prepare themselves? Did they fail before that? How did they deal with the challenges? That story is never told. So what I did is, and I had never thought, with my background in zoology, environmental sciences, toxicology, and then science education, I never thought that I would be a faculty at the Indian Institute of Management here in Ahmedabad, a management school. I mean, that was the first time during my job interview that I stepped into an IIM. So I have no connections with this management school or any management school. And that's the beauty of academia, that you never know where life takes you. But what I also saw is very competitive students. There's a lot of focus on projecting an image of success. And the reason I say projecting an image of success is because people don't feel as confident all the time, but they are told to project this image that you have to be successful, you have to be competitive all the time, which also comes at a huge cost of mental health. You start competing more than collaborating, and a variety of different things. So I actually teach a PGP course, an MBA course that's called Managing Self-Limiting Beliefs in Education and Training. I talk of a number of things about self-limiting beliefs. How do we develop our beliefs about education and training, and so on and so forth. And what we do in that class is we talk about our failures. And just talking about your failures, writing about your failures also gives you context about how you feel, how you think, how the brain works. For example, someone might write, you know, I feel like a failure because I was all India rank 101 and I could not get into my preferred choice of college. Whereas someone writes that I tried for the IIT JEE for 5 years and then I gave up. So in both these examples, people are talking about what they think as failures. But people also see how other people are talking about failures. And I always get this wow and aha moment when students realize that it's not just me who's experiencing failure or who has experienced failure. Everyone around me in this class, including the professor, has experienced failure. So I really enjoy those conversations. I've learned a lot out of those conversations. And that's also my new line of research that I've started recently about how we make meaning around failures. So if you are on Instagram, there's a page called CV of Failures. You can check it out. The students at IMA manage that page. They take entries of people writing about the failures and they post it, the stories around it. So I recommend you check it out. So it's been 10 minutes since I've been talking. I hope I've given you a good understanding about what I do, where I come from. I would love it if you post maybe a few very specific questions. I do have a lot to talk about, but I feel like I'm just talking, I'm the single person talking in a room. So I would love to hear about some of the questions that you are thinking about. I'll take a question or two and then I'll move on to the other things. How about that?
Yeah, so if people have questions, please feel free to either write on the chat box or raise your hand and ask a question or two.
So if you could raise your hand on here and
so
tell me how many of you are PhD students. I just want to know how many of you are PhD students in this crowd.
Okay.
If you could just raise your hand. Okay, many of you. Got it.
Ma'am, there's a question on the chat box as well.
Yeah. So what is failure? Is it like an automatic meaning-making machine? Could you be a little more specific? Because different people think about failures in many different ways. So there's no one way of thinking about failures. People often confuse failures with rejections, and we get a lot of rejections in academia, almost every day. So if you could, Sumit, if you could be a little more specific, that would help me.
So, ma'am, by failure, I say, why should we ascribe? Means it's more normative in nature. Why do we actually ascribe the meaning of failure? Because failure again might have some variables which gets operationalized into that particular happening, or say even tomorrow it might not remain. So there are several theories about grief and all. So today there may be X feeling, tomorrow there may be Y feeling. It may not remain a failure at all. It's not a reality. It's what you construe. It's a constructivist approach, or basically an interpretivist, I'll call it. So it's a hermeneutical defect, I'll say. It's not an event. So why to give so much of importance to such an event, which is not which is not right, which is not important for a researcher?
Well, you tell me, because people do give importance. People have their life.
So why not? So, ma'am, the question is, why not invest our resources in telling them it is not an important thing to invest time and your mental energy on it? Means,
see, it's an inward journey. It's not it's not my place to tell someone how they should talk and how they should feel about their failure, right? Because it is valid for the person who's experiencing it. So, but what happens is often there's no conversation around failures. There's a shame associated with failures. And my aim, my goal, at least with my students, is can we at least have an open platform? Can we have a safe space where we can talk about it? You're right that the meaning of failure changes. What was failure for me 5 years ago may not be the same in 5 years. But at that point of time, and that's how many human beings respond to failures, it feels like that's the end of everything, because somehow the brain perceives it to be a real threat, right? So one thing, and I see some other good questions. For example, Chetna talks about how to distinguish between imposter syndrome and an actual lack of competence. That's a very good question. And I did have a point here. See, imposter syndrome has become one of those buzzwords that everyone likes to talk about. I mean, I've heard so many people say, oh, I have imposter syndrome. But not everyone does. People may think that they do. One key feature that distinguishes imposter syndrome is for people who experience it. It usually happens immediately after a big success for people who feel like imposters. So if you do not feel like an imposter, you will not be able to relate to that feeling. But for people who do, you get a success, you have a paper published, and that fear hits you that, oh my God, my paper is out there for everyone to read. So now people will get to know that I don't know anything about my field. I've done some random useless calculations and now it's out there for people are going to laugh at me. So their imagination becomes a very real reality. And that is the sign of someone who feels like an imposter. Whereas someone who doesn't have competence at that point, what they're feeling is not imposter syndrome. It might be something else. They might be able to develop that competence and achieve something, and then that imposter syndrome might hit them. But what I see is a lot of people say I have imposter syndrome, but technically, if you scientifically look at the term, I don't think that many people do.
Ma'am, before you go forward, I mean, just to take on from whatever you, spoke about immediate success and followed by imposter syndrome. So, how do you kind of distinguish between the constant calls, or I mean, whatever is written in the books, at least for a sense of modesty, humility, and then again, there is this, imposter syndrome coming. So do you think, I mean, if there's an imposter syndrome, you're actually kind of being humble, and I mean, no, it's not a negative trait as such. What's your view on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my view is actually based on hundreds of interviews that I've done over the years. So I've done more than 500 interviews with different people in different settings. Imposter syndrome is different from being humble or being modest. Now, being humble or modest could be a part of also people who feel like imposters. But I'll give you an example. There's a fictitious voice in your head that says that you just published a paper in economics in a very good journal, but you actually do not know anything about that subject. And it's a fictitious voice, but it's very real in your head. So what would happen is for the next few months or years, you would not apply for a job. You would not go to a conference, or you would go to a conference, but you would never speak up. Or you would do certain things, like certain tangible things that have an impact on your career. Whereas if you're humble or modest, you're humble and modest, but you still speak about your work with humility and with modesty. Now, there can be different manifestations. I'm just giving this as an example. It's also possible that someone feels like an imposter crunching data, but they don't feel like an imposter when they go up on a stage and they talk about their work. So it's completely possible that you feel like an imposter in a certain thing and you don't feel like an imposter in another thing. It's possible that you are a very successful career person, but you feel like an imposter as a parent. So that is also possible. It's not a black or white thing. There are so many shades and we don't even understand all the shades, because the scales that measure imposter syndrome are mostly West-centric, white-centric scales. They are not tuned to the cultural differences that different people in different parts of the world have. We are in the process of developing better scales that would enhance our understanding. But you can't just take a scale, give it to people here, and they'll get a certain score, but I can't say with complete confidence that, yes, this is what makes you feel like an imposter. So there are so many nuances to that.
Ma'am, would you like to take one more question? From
one more question. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll have Shubhendu. I think he's got his hands up for a long time. So Shubhendu Noshkar, if you can go ahead.
No, Himadri, actually it was to raise my hand when ma'am asked about who are PhD students.
Okay, fine.
Sorry.
So,
okay,
no worries. I see a question by Shudipto or Shudipta. I'll just read that out, that as compared to other postgraduate students, PhD is a long journey. How to face the mental agony when we are getting stuck and not, oh my God, I have so much to talk about this. No data collection, other analysis can't be carried on. Thanks in advance. Okay. So let me take this question because it's an important question and it also ties to what I wanted to share with you today. You're right. PhD is a long journey, and what makes it different from any other program is that it is unstructured. So you talk to two different PhDs from two different institutions, and no two people would have had the same experience. Some labs or some advisors work differently. They have a very structured approach. You finish, you do this, you are done in 3 to 4 years. Whereas in some other fields, some other labs, you drag on for 6 years, 7 years, and it just goes on and on. So no two PhDs have the same experience. It's also very unstructured. It could get very unstructured. PhD is also the time when you are shifting. And what do I mean by you're shifting? You're shifting from being primarily a consumer of knowledge to a producer of knowledge. Because that's the idea of a PhD. You produce new knowledge that was not there before. And a lot of PhD students, including me, have struggled because we don't have this understanding. And our education system from the very beginning, from school, has taught us to simply take directions, do a bunch of stuff, follow protocol, and produce an answer. Let's think about it a little bit. I mean, I don't know if you would disagree with me, but I think most people in this room will agree with me that your school, your high school, your college, undergraduate training, even postgraduate training, master's training, you read books, you passively take in knowledge, you are given question papers, you produce answers. But the point of a PhD is not just to find those answers. The point of a good PhD is to know how to ask the important questions. And that is where a lot of students stumble because they just do not know. They have never been taught how to think independently, how to come up with those questions. And that some people learn, some people do not. The first time I started my PhD at the University of Washington, very prestigious program, among the top programs in the world, but I could not finish that PhD. So I started within a quarter, 3 months, I knew that I would not be able to survive here. I had freshly moved from India. There was a huge culture difference. Although I spoke English, culturally it was different. The weather was different. I was on my own. So I transferred to a master's program and I finished the master's program. I wanted to do a PhD. So I took off, I took a few years off. I just tried to understand what does this take to do a PhD? I can't be, I knew that I'm smart. I just could not figure out what do I need to do to get that PhD. 2010, I started again, University of Virginia. I've already had 4 years of experience of getting a master's degree, working in the industry in the US. I knew the country well. And this time I had a plan. I knew what to do. And I finished in about 3 years, just because I knew what I have to do from day one, which is I have to come up with questions independently and I have to solve them. Now I'll set into another area that is one of the questions that one of you asked in the registration form, which I think is a very important question. It ties back to the fear of your advisor. Someone said, what if your prof is not friendly and only talks about professional things? That was one of the questions. And I was thinking of that question. First of all, let's deconstruct the word advisor. You need to ask yourself, what is the role of your advisor in your life? Is it for them to be friendly? What are you looking for in an advisor? Are you looking for your friend? No, I mean, it's good that if they are friendly, but that's not their primary purpose. The primary purpose of an advisor is to advise. Now, what would they advise you on? They would advise you on the work that you're doing. So someone, a very close friend who was doing a PhD at the same time that I was at Princeton University, he told me a very nice thing. It's a very simple thing. He said that he was in computer science and engineering, and he said that I treat my advisor like a consultant. So I'm doing my own project. If I need his help, because of course he's the expert in the field, he knows way more than I do, then I'll treat him as a consultant. Whereas there are many other PhD students, if you ask them, who is your advisor? What do you think your advisor is? People will say terms like guru, God. So that also shows a difference in the way you see your advisor. I love this, that you think of your advisor as a consultant. If you need advice, you go up to him, but you want to do your own independent work. The other thing, and my own advisor gave me this analogy, which I loved, is a PhD advisor is like a driving instructor. He or she is teaching you how to drive a car. Okay. But where do you want to go driving that car? Whether you want to go up to the mountains or the seas, whether you want to do a road trip or just keep your car in the garage and never take it out, that's your decision. So when you think of your advisor as a consultant or as a driving instructor, the onus of doing the work comes to you. You are in charge. Your advisor is not in charge. Which is why, as long as your advisor is professional, I think that's a great thing. You don't want your advisor to be asking you to run off to the market and get vegetables and fruits for them or do their household jobs for them. That's what they showed back in the 90s in the Jaspal Bhatti show, right? But you need to reflect about who is your advisor in your life. What role does he or she play in your PhD? Because ultimately the PhD is your journey. It's absolutely 100% your journey and what you make out of it. So I wanted to show you something on that note, because we are talking about failures and how we make meaning of failures. And of course, publication is one thing that comes up a lot in these questions. How do I publish? Where do I publish? How do I deal with failures? What can I do? One question is, where do I publish? Should I target higher journals? Should I target lower journals? Honestly, I came to know about this list of journals only after I came to IIM Ahmedabad. Prior to that, I had never seen a list before. And I mean, there's a lot of fields, a lot of universities that do not have a list, and they're doing just fine. Now, how do they do just fine? Of course, you should stick to the list if your institute gives you one, because I came to know of a lot of journals because of that list. But what do we do? I mean, when you write a paper, you write a literature review, right? So you're reviewing other papers. You see where all they have published, what all journals they have published in. And as you read more and more, you read critically. How do you read papers? You read papers for content. You read papers for language. You read papers for the quality of the papers that you think it is. You'll develop that intuition about where does my work fit. Is it good enough that I can target one of the journals that is in my reference section? That is what I would do. My advisor told me something else that was very interesting. I mean, unless a journal is a predatory journal, you absolutely don't go for predatory journals. These are the journals that invite you to publish their work. Stay away from them. But as long as they are not predatory journals, as long as they are good journals in the field, just go for any journal that will accept your paper. Because really the power lies in the journal more than the power lies in you. Also, these journal ratings are fluid. So a journal that's not that good today might be very good tomorrow. You don't know that, right? So keep all this in mind. Some people ask me, oh, should I even target a B journal? I just want to go for FT50s. A B journal is not going to take you half the amount of time. It will still take you that much of time to publish. A B journal will not. So the question that quality versus quantity is a wrong question to begin with, because you need to have a basic quality of all the papers you publish. But every paper takes its own time. It also depends on what stage of life you are in. So maybe you are a finishing PhD student and you need to find a job soon. So you need more papers. So you might go for slightly less risky journals. Or maybe you need to get tenure in the next 1 or 2 years. So you need to show more numbers at that point to keep your job. That is when you might go for slightly less risky journals. But let's say you have a lot of time. Let's say you're not in a hurry. Take those chances. Always send it to the best journal, because even if they reject you, as long as it gets reviewed, you'll get some very good feedback. So you can improve your paper based on the, so I don't see journal rejection as a bad thing, as long as it's not desk rejected. If it's desk rejected, you can't help it, but they do it pretty soon. They don't waste your time. But even if a paper is rejected from a good journal, they give you very good feedback to improve your paper. So take that feedback. And there are so many, I mean, good journals are looking for good papers, just like good papers are looking for good journals. So it's a process of pairing them together. And on that note, I want to share a document with you. I'll tell you a little bit about this document. I don't know if any of you document the process of writing and submitting and publishing papers. I don't know if you document the process, because all this comes under invisible work, the work that no one can see. So let's say Himadri has published 4 journals. That is what we see, that he has published 4 papers, not 4 journals. What we don't see is the number of times Himadri got a rejection or a revise and resubmit and a rejection after that. And what did he learn from that process? So I don't know if we do it, but I've started doing it. And that's really good. You know why? Because you need a plan for rejections also. We usually have a plan for success. Okay, this is what I need to do. I need 5 papers. I need this, I need that. But we never have a contingency plan for failures. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of power, so to speak, knowing that this is the invisible work you put in and this is what you got. So I'll go ahead and I'll share a document with you. It looks a little bit, I hope you all can see the document. You don't have to start reading it. I'll just tell you how to make sense of the document, but I hope you can start. I mean, I hope you can see the document, right?
Yeah, it's visible. It's visible.
Yeah. So this is, like the title says, it's this year's log of papers, of work that I have done. Now, this will not be what your document looks like if you did one, because you may be a faculty, you may not be a faculty, you may be a PhD student, it will look different. But anything that is orange is work that has already been rejected. Just hear me out carefully. Anything that's orange is work that's already rejected. Anything that is green is work that has been accepted already. And anything that doesn't have a color is work that's still under review. So this is the color coding that I follow. And there are different ways of doing it. Okay. Now, if you see, there are 4 columns here. The first column looks at the chronology of events. That is how I have, the entire document is organized based on the dates and not on the papers. The second column is the name of the journal, and I've removed all the names because journal names don't matter. The third one is a paper, and the fourth one is a status. So if you see, here's a paper 1, which means this is 1A means the first journal it went to. Okay. 1B is the second journal it went to. 1C is the third journal it went to. 1D is the fourth journal that first paper went to. So I hope this makes sense. This logic makes sense, because as long as it does, we can now look at the details of what this document tells you. So make sure that you understand the framework of the document, which is orange is reject, green is accept, and white is still under consideration. And the entire document is listed chronologically, and the journal names are based on the papers that were sent to them. So if you see, there's a lot of activity. I would give you a second to make sense of this document first, and I hope you can see it clearly, and then just ask me some questions. I think that's a better way than me telling you how to interpret this document. Charlene, go ahead. I hope I said your name properly. Yeah.
Yes, correctly. Ma'am, my question is that, you could be in a stage of writing writing the paper, but not submitted it as yet, or it could be submitted, but not yet received a response. Yeah. So currently the orange and the green indicate where you've received a response.
Yeah, they were all rejected.
Correct. The orange and the green, so rejected or accepted. And then you have a stage where you've completed and you have submitted, or you are in the process of writing.
No. Writing I have not even included. Those are like 10 different papers that I'm writing right now. anything that has been submitted.
Okay, so this is only submissions.
Well, I did update this, so all of them are under review now.
Okay, so what is the blue color R&R?
Oh,
Does
blue
that
is
blue
like-
color signify anything?
Yeah, blue is good news that I just got an R&R
Okay.
2 days ago. So now my focus will be on working on the blue. So I drop everything I'm doing right now and I just focus on that blue document.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, Vivek.
Yeah, ma'am. So it's like it's based on the document, but it's not exactly on the document. So my question is more about how to, and this is from my own experience of having tried to submit to journals.
Yeah.
So I found a big difference between, like, as you said, like earlier education, post-graduation and doctoral studies is also there is no fixed standard. So, and like the reviewer comments seem to be like it needs an interpretation of its own. It's like sometimes you don't know what is to be done to figure that out. And then there are like the pragmatic side of it, there are decisions to be made. Sometimes do you kind of like bring down, like do you withdraw the paper and send it somewhere else? Do you kind of try to do what they're saying? So sometimes like reviewers ask you to almost do things which is a new paper. Like it's almost kind of like do things which is not that paper. So I wanted to kind of your thoughts on those, like how to make those decisions.
You ask an excellent question and I want to take my time to answer to this. So I'll take my time to do it. So let me take a few more questions based on this and then I'll come back to your question, Vivek, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, Sugha?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is also more regarding the process. I mean, I can see at least 7 papers that are here in this particular table. So what I want to ask is that how do you come up with a plan to manage 7 papers at the same time? I mean, because it's very difficult. And what according to you is an appropriate number? Like how many projects should you have in the pipeline? So that, you know, your publication process does not suffer. Because with me, I face this challenge that if I'm working on something, my entire attention is devoted to that one particular research. So
maybe I'll go back to, Vivek question that also ties to your question. Very good questions. See, I'll give you the answer that's my story, but it may or may not be your story. For example, this doesn't have to be your document. If you're a student, you don't need to work with 8 papers. I'm just at a different stage in my career. But here is the thing. Reviewer comments are of broadly 3 kinds. Comments that you can address, that are good comments that you can address, good comments that you cannot address, and comments that you don't need to address at all. Okay, now, what I've done over the years is I've developed the intuition of reading between the lines. So this paper that I got an R&R the day before yesterday, they gave me 6 pages worth of revisions to do. But I also picked from their language that they are very excited about the paper. They just don't like it as much yet, but they are excited about the paper, which means it makes sense for me to put my energy in that journal. Now, if you can do the changes without altering the soul of your paper, just do it. Sometimes they'll ask you to cite papers that you don't think should be cited, but take the path of least resistance. If adding 2 papers to make them happy works, just do it. Sometimes they'll ask you to change the methodology or go collect more data. If that changes the soul of your paper, don't go for it. Because at the end of the day, it's just a journal. And if they say something that doesn't make sense, then push back. I mean, you don't have to fight with them, be polite, but say why this particular comment does not make sense. Like, the same paper, it's a qualitative paper where I've also collected some survey data, but it's not a mixed method paper. Now, one of the comments I got is, why are you calling it a qualitative paper and not a mixed method paper? It should be a mixed method. So now I'm writing that, no, it is not a mixed method paper because the mixing has not happened. It's primarily a qualitative paper. No one knows your paper better than you do. Remember that. So if you think you can change something, do it. If you think something should not be changed, don't do it. There'll always be another journal, but and I have done this in the past, that I have in the Lure, I mean, there's a paper that went through 3 rounds of revise and resubmit, ate up 6 months of my life, and then they rejected it. And apparently they hated the revisions more than they hated the original paper. But when I looked at that paper, the paper had completely become a different paper, and even I did not like that paper anymore. So don't do that. Now, regarding what should you be doing, where should you focus on energy? Focus your energy. Again, depends on what stage of life you are in. When you start off as a PhD student, you have limited data you're working on. You're mostly dependent on your advisor and your advisor's project. But as you become more independent, you are doing different projects. You have students working with you, which is why you can do a lot. It kind of goes more like a inverted triangle. But what I make sure I do is at any given point of time, I have at least 1 or 2 papers under review, at least one or two papers under revise and resubmit, 1 or 2 papers that I'm writing, and 1 or 2 papers that are in my head. So the idea is in my head, but I haven't written about that. You won't have a pipeline if you don't do that. You have to have at least a paper in your head, a paper that you're writing, a paper that is under review, and a paper that's under revise and resubmit. Because you can see there are 8 papers I'm juggling here right now. But by the end of this year, I'll have like maybe 2 papers, not more than that. I already have one that is in green. Maximum I'll get maybe this one, the one in blue. Maybe that is the one that I'll make it. So if you have 2 papers in the cycle, then you may not end up getting any publications. If you have 5 to 6 papers, then you might end up getting 1 or 2, the so-called success. The other thing you'll see here, if you look at the leftmost column, is work often happens in a sine curve. So March, I was very busy. March 3, March 11, March 11, March 25, April. Very busy. And then all the papers went under review. So May, there was no activity going on. Again, that flurry of activity started in June, a little bit in July, a little bit in August, but since September, nothing has happened. See, when your paper is getting reviewed, you don't have anything to do. It's not in your hands anymore. But if a paper comes back to you hopefully with a revise and resubmit, you don't want to become the bottleneck. So right now, for this paper, I'm the bottleneck, which is the sooner I can complete the revise and resubmit, the sooner the paper can go back into the ecosystem, which is why I've stopped the 6 other papers that I'm writing, and I've focused all my energy there. So you need to take the whole publication process as a system and not just as discrete things that you are doing, that when you're working on one paper, you spend 1 year working on that paper, and then you work in a series. I'm parallel processing all the time. Now, in a given day, I would be working on 1 paper, but in a given month, I work on 4 to 5 papers easily. But that's also because I have a lot of data. If you have a lot of data, nothing better than that. So I've spent about 1.5 years before this only collecting data, where I did not write a single paper. If you look at my CV, what you'll see is for the first many years of my career, I was publishing 1 paper a year. But that was the time that all this invisible work was happening. In the background, I was collecting all the data in the background. And now that I have all the data, now I'm publishing multiple papers a year. So that is how the process works. Other questions?
There's one on the chat box.
Okay. If you could read it for me.
Yeah, I'll do that. So Dhaval Jadhav asks, my question is not regarding the session title, it is on the scales we use. Madam, as you said that Western empowerment on scales or wide scale, would like to listen more on this. I support your view of scales that they are made somewhere else and might not reflect the condition they are being used in our that are being used in our research work. So if you can share some more views on that.
See, Dhaval, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
you can only work with what you have. You can't work with what you don't have. So currently, if There's a scale that's available. It's not the best scale, but that's the only scale you have. Work with that. And in the process, you go develop your own scale, which by the way is going to take years for you. So if you have a target of finishing a PhD and finding a job, don't take things that will take a long time. You all see, the dissertation is not the end of your research career. It's just the beginning of your research career. Which is why don't get into projects that will take a long time to finish. You can always do that after your PhD. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Pragya?
And there's, yeah, Pragya.
So I'm talking about the R&R. I have this question that suppose if the journal gives us a period of say 4 months to finish the revision and submit it back to them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
should we wait for a period of time for the deadline to arrive, or should we just finish it as soon as possible and resubmit?
See, this journal, September 27 has given me 90 days, but I'm going to resubmit it by Sunday. Because again, I don't want to be the bottleneck. And there is nothing sweeter than the news of a paper published. The other thing is, remember that they might still not like my paper. So they'll come up with a second round of revise and resubmit. So if you follow that 4-month protocol, you're looking at a 4-year deadline from submission to acceptance. Don't be the backlog. Just drop everything and finish this as soon as you can. Because this is a fruit that you kind of have closer to your hand versus a paper that you're writing, but it's much farther in the process. The other thing I wanted to talk about from this document is just see that even with desk reject, sometimes journals take a month to even desk reject. And these are things you have no control over, which is why remember that you should not become the bottleneck. Journals will be the bottleneck all the time because they are working with multiple papers and they don't care about you, the person. But you see how subjective this process is. More importantly, I think you'll find a lot of value in creating your own document rather than just see my document and make sense of that. I mean, I can still take any questions from the document, but this document just shows me how subjective this process is. And at the end of the day, how hard I have worked. Because sometimes, again, you start doubting yourself. Am I working enough? Do I deserve to be here? What am I doing? I have nothing to show. This is what I've got to show. I have only one paper to show this year, but this is the entire document. It shows what all I have done. And it also gives you a mental, you can manage your time better. Because if you have 7 papers under review, at some point, I know that all these papers will come back together. And then I'll have to process those, either reject, I have to find a new home, or revise and resubmit, in which case I have to spend more time working on that. So you also need to manage your time. So I know I've kept my post Durga Pujo till December. I have kept no big meetings, no nothing, because I know that all these 7 papers at some stage will come back and all my energy will be focused. I have not kept any teaching. This also shows, see, Jan, Feb, none of these papers, you don't see Jan and Feb because I was teaching in January and February. So that is the time you send out your papers for review, and then you focus on teaching, because as a faculty, you're doing research, but you're teaching, and also you're traveling, and you're also, going to conferences. All that is not happening, but it still takes up mental space. So this will show you how to manage your time better. I'll stop sharing the document. Yeah.
And there's a question on the chat box by an individual. I think his name is not mentioned here. So how to deal with the final stages of the PhD? Like you have to submit PhD as well as you need a job. You're worried about the job. And also I'll add, maybe you don't have a publication with you and you're suffering from a lack of confidence. So how do you manage in that kind of a scenario?
See, it all depends on how you see it. Like you could, from what you say, Himadri, the wordings, the sense I get is it's a stressful process. Is there a way you can think about it as a fun process? Is there a way you can see it as a good challenge to have and see what will happen? Because what is the worst that can happen? think about it. What is the worst that can happen? I don't know what is the worst that can happen in this particular situation. That maybe you don't find a job right away, but you find one eventually. For all the worries that I've had over the years about what is going to happen, I'm glad, knock on wood, that I've never been unemployed in my life. Something has worked out, whether it be in the US or I had to move to Germany to find a job, whatever it is, things have worked out. So you need to think a little bit broadly. You also need to plan ahead of time. So one thing I ask PhD students is, are you spending time going through the websites of faculty of your dream institutions where you would love to have a job? You may or may not, but places that you would love to be considered at. And are you looking at their faculty profiles, and are you seeing what kind of journals are they publishing in? What kind of papers do they have? Because when you start interviewing, what are people looking? You need to understand the mindset of people that are either hiring you, or you have to understand the mindset of journals that are considering your paper. You have to understand your audience. Now, what are employers looking for? Primarily in academia, employers want people who can teach, who can do research, and who can also fit with other colleagues. So if you already know who these people are, if you know what kind of papers they are writing, and you go for an interview and you talk intelligently about, I love the work that you do, it signals to people that you spend time learning about those institutions. So of course, there is the stress of paper writing, completing your dissertation, data analysis, but maybe for some time every day, you can take a break from all that stressful work and just go job hunt. Just look at different institutions and what are they offering. I think it's only this balance that will make the process less stressful, because then you're constantly not doing one kind of thing. Apurva?
Yeah, hello, ma'am. Good evening. Ma'am, I have a question. I heard, I'm at a very early stage of my PhD. I have heard that if your paper is published, like if you're working on some other topic for your thesis, but like pre PhD, you published your paper or you worked on something that is not related to your thesis. So will it be counted as my publication, or as my working paper or something like that?
Counted by whom?
Like, will it be counted in my CV if I write it as if I count it as my publication? Will it be counted?
See, you should list anything that you have done in your CV. Now, whether your employer is going to recognize it or not is a different thing that you don't know. So I have different things in toxicology that is listed in my CV simply because I've done it. And now I have a lot of things in education because I'm doing those things. So just list whatever you have done. Now, whether people consider it or not is not in your hands, right?
Okay. Got it.
See, remember your PhD or your academic journey, and I can only speak for academia because that is the only world I mostly know. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You're here for the long term. So you need to pace yourself. If you run too fast at the very beginning and get tired, you probably will get too tired to continue. You just want to mute yourself. I hear a lot of background noise. Just mute yourself. But you are here for the marathon. You are not here for the sprint, which is why you need to pace yourself. You can't just get out of breath. Okay. Okay, there's another hand, but I don't know what the name is.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, audible.
Yeah. Hi, ma'am. I'm Gautam. I might not actually fit in this crowd. I'm actually a master's student from this institute called Chennai Mathematical Institute in South India. So like my question was, like, I'm actually doing a master's right now, and I have been working as a research assistant for about a year now. And my research area in specific does not have that many companies or professors working in India. Like in this particular scenario, I guess, like, I have this option of doing a second master's or a PhD. Like, I just want to know what your thoughts are on this. Like, I'm not exactly sure what to do. Like I'm extremely interested though in this particular field. Like it's called causal inference. So yeah, I'm very much interested, but like the number of options, or I'm just like, I've not been in this situation before, so I'm not sure what I'll like.
Yeah. So there are different ways of answering this, and you should not listen to me if you don't like my answer, because there's no one right answer. I can only give you different ways of looking at it. First of all, the amount of time you spend getting a degree is the amount of time that you're not spending either doing the job or working. That's one way to look at it. Secondly, the things that you want to learn about, do you really need a degree for it? Or can you learn it on your own? The third thing is it going to signal to your future employers anything? 2 degrees. Sometimes multiple degrees make people frown about what this person really wants. So these are the things that you need to think about. But if you really want to learn something, I would say identify people wherever in the world that you can go that are doing that work, and talk to them and ask them that because see, there's no guarantee that a second degree is going to assure you a job or whatever, a PhD or whatever you want to do. The other thing is a lot of the things I do in my current work, I have learned on the job. My PhD did not teach me how to teach. My PhD did not teach me how to write paper reviews. So no matter where you end up, you are going to learn a lot on that job. You need to weigh your pros and cons. You need to make a list, 2 columns, pros and cons, and just talk to people who work on causal inference. Maybe they will give you new ways of seeing this. I hope this is not vague, but there's no right answer to whether you should do this or you should do that.
Okay. Yeah, I get the perspective, and that's what I wanted. Thank you.
Yeah. So the other thing, and I see a few hands, but let me quickly because I'm also looking at the time and I want to be respectful of your time. Social media pressure, that's another question that came up, that there's a lot of pressure when you go to LinkedIn and you see people post about stuff, and how do you deal with that? So that is the question that came. My response to it is, are you mindful about what are you consuming on social media? Because social media in itself is neither good nor bad. I see social media as an excellent platform to find participants for my study. The imposter syndrome project that I did, I found hundreds of people just because I advertised my study on social media. Now, are you consuming content passively on social media, or are you creating content on social media? You need to think about that. If you are passively consuming content, if you are just looking at people and all their, people whom you don't even know, but you see this list of things that they have done, then obviously that's going to affect your mental health. So, I should just probably say it out in the open that I mostly don't read stuff on social media, on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn and Twitter to share the work that I am doing in case someone is interested. But I don't spend time scrolling through social media and feeling bad about myself. I'm very conscious about that. I try to stay out of news or any kind of controversial news. It's very addictive. It gives you a dopamine rush to go and look at what people are doing, what people are fighting about. I stay away from any of that. I do use social media to share my work for people who might be interested. The second thing is think about how people share stuff on social media. A typical comment would be, oh, so grateful to God, I finished my this, blah, 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 and feeling joyful and blah, blah. It's telling you the end point. It's telling you nothing about the process. So it's not a useful piece of information. Can you more mindfully write on social media? For example, can you create your list of log of research papers that you're going to do and share your experiences in social media? Because that's a story in itself. There's something for people to learn rather than just posting a snapshot of you getting a degree and saying, hey, today I graduated. Yeah, but what was the process like? People don't talk about processes. And that is probably what causes this huge, I mean, I can't think of the word, but this imbalance between how you perceive people's successes and what exactly that success means. So be mindful about what you're doing on social media. Are you just passively consuming content, or are you creating content and sharing on social media? Okay, Rohit, you have your hands up. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening. Ma'am, I'm working basically on crypto currency. I had started after my FDP only. Ma'am, I'm working on not only research part but also coding part, as it was my interest. And I have developed, you can say, a kind of a crypto token. Now, ma'am, I wanted to know, I will publish it as a research paper, everything. And can I just have a patent or a trademark on it, like something, our work can be get a Indian recognition or government recognition, that is possible?
I don't know, Rohit, and when I don't know things, I just say it, better than giving you some arbitrary answer, but I really don't know. So you'll have to ask someone who's in your field. Okay?
Yes, ma'am. I'm
Yeah.
definitely working. Thank you, ma'am, and nice to talk to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. I see one more hand, Sugandh. Sugandh or Sugandha? Sugandh.
Sugandh, ma'am. It's Sugandh.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, back to what you were discussing about social media and about mindful consumption. I don't know, this might be a digression, but I mean, I try to convince myself whenever I look at someone doing something in their personal life or in their professional life. So I mean, I try to convince myself to be happy if someone has achieved something. So but there are times when you I mean, unconsciously also you do feel that sort of pressure, that because somebody is doing something, so probably you are not doing something in your life correctly, or you are lacking on certain aspects. So can such consumption of content also lead to you developing an imposter syndrome or something of that sort? I mean, I'm just making
imposter syndrome is very different. Imposter syndrome is very different from what you're saying, which is also a very relatable emotion, that you just don't feel happy about something that you read. You feel like, oh my God, why not me? But if that's the emotion that's coming to you, own it and live through it. I mean, the only way you'll get over it is by living through it. There's no other way of dealing with it, right? I mean, it especially could happen if you applied for a fellowship, let's say a Fulbright fellowship, and you did not get it, and someone else got it. It's very normal to feel that way. So just feel it and get over it, and then try again. But yeah, whether it would lead to you feeling like an imposter, I don't know about that, because people who feel like imposters because of the successes that they got, and not necessarily, I mean, peer comparison could be a part of it, but it may not be the entire story.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. So Himadri, any I see a lot of questions, but it's hard for me to read the questions. And so anything that you would like me to cover in the last maybe few final minutes?
Maybe, I mean, there's this question by Navya. I don't know whether this is appropriate, but like she asked whether one should go for short-term research fellowships abroad or anywhere else in India, or simply focus on dissertation and other research activities. She's speaking from the point of view of a first-year PhD student.
Yeah. So again, the answer to that is the answer I give to most other questions, which is it depends on what you want to do in life. And you may not know what you want to do in life, and it's completely fine. But eventually, if you want to work in a different country, then this is an excellent way to create some contacts, and also to show that, I mean, there are some excellent, the Humboldt Fellowship in Germany or the Fulbright in the US. These are very competitive. So if you have one of them in your CV, that makes your CV look so good. So again, it depends on what do you want to do. If you want to get that experience, I mean, I personally, I'm a big fan of traveling and understanding the world through travels. All these places that I have been in and worked at is because I just enjoy being in different environments. If you are that kind of a person, go for it. But if you think you'll get homesick, you don't want to, you just want to be in that niche and just focus on your PhD. then just do it. So there's no wrong answer to it. It all depends on what you want out of your PhD. I hope this made you think differently about the process of not just struggling in academia or trying to make it, but also thriving and feeling happy about being in academia. And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Devoshmita. I think, I mean, your talk for once was actually very candid. I mean, in terms of whatever you spoke about your struggles and your, I mean, failures and ability to thrive from them. And I'm sure we are going to take a lot of, I mean, inspirational stuff from whatever you spoke, and it will help us in our future academic progress. So thank you to the audience for all the questions, and thank you, ma'am, once again for answering them so very patiently. And we look forward to having you in our campus someday, whenever. I mean, you were told that you would be in campus, but somehow we couldn't kind of manage some of the things. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Anyways, it was really nice of you sharing all your difficult stories and about the imposter syndrome. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And I'll stay back a little bit because I wanted to chat with you a little bit more.
Okay, so now I'll stop. I'll stop the recording then.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.